Thank you very much. I wanted my presentation to reflect the changes that have taken place in the Palestinian society during the last few months. So what essentially I describe here as a new era is not meant to describe a new political era, but rather a new era in Palestinian public perception. In other words, if there were no changes in Palestinian political attitudes, I would not have titled this as a new era. There are significant changes in the way the Palestinian public perceives these issues, at least the first three issues, that warrant describing the environment where the Palestinians are today as being a new era. The most important characteristics or features of this era is that the Palestinians today are more optimistic about the future, about what will happen tomorrow, about the ability of the Palestinians and Israelis to be partners in a peace agreement. It indicates another feature of the new era is the change in the balance of power. During the last 4 years, there has been significant changes in the level of support for the different factions, from Fatah to Hamas. And the last 4 years have essentially strengthened the support for Hamas. Hamas has almost doubled its strength up until recently, when it began to lose some of this strength. The decline in the level of support for Hamas is so significant that because it comes along with other changes, that I believe it reflects a significant change in not only in that is simply a reflection to things like elections, for example, and the fact that Hamas boycotted the elections, but I think something even more important. And the third change has to do with the level of support for the peace process, which I think is probably the one that has witnessed the most significant change in attitude. And part of this change is what has been referred to today in terms of the changing attitudes of Palestinians and Israelis with regard to the permanent status issues. The change with regard to the role of violence is minimum to non-existent. And this is where it is very clear to me that the change in the perception of the role of violence has to come or will come only after Israel takes steps, not before. There is no doubt that the build-up in terms of increased level of support for violence has reflected the pain and suffering that the Palestinians have been enduring during the last 4 years. This pain and suffering led Palestinians to want revenge, led Palestinians to conclude that Israel wants them dead, wants them going through humiliation, through checkpoints, etc., and that the only way that the Palestinians should respond to this Israeli desire is by inflicting the same pain and suffering on the Israelis. This attitude of the Palestinians has not changed, despite the changes that we see today. And I think the fact it did not change, in my view, reflect that what I said earlier about the perception of pain and suffering. And the only side that can remove this pain and suffering and therefore affect the level of support for violence is Israel. As long as the Palestinians see the checkpoints, as long as the closure regime is in place, as long as Palestinians turn on their television to see homes being destroyed, the wall being built inside the West Bank, as long as that is what they see, this is the life of the Palestinians, my conclusion is that we will not see change there. So, in other words, this is a change that Israel can affect. This is a change that to a large extent is subject to how Israel deals with the other changes that we are now witnessing. Now, I want also to say, before I show you these changes, that when the fact, of course, that the Palestinians, that 63% of the Palestinians voted for Mahmoud Abbas, is certainly consolidates what I have concluded with regard to public opinion earlier. We did an exit poll on the day of elections. One of the purposes of the exit poll was to find out what the voters wanted in selecting their candidates. And the candidates who selected or elected, the voters who elected Mahmoud Abbas essentially told us that about 2/3 of them told us that the reason they are electing him is because they want him to reach a peace agreement with Israel. They want him to improve the economic conditions. They want him to enforce law and order. In that order that I've just described. That's where the majority of the Palestinian public is, and this is the reason they have elected Mahmoud Abbas. So I think we're not just talking about speculation where the public is. With the election of Mahmoud Abbas, we're even more certain that this is the wish, this is the will of the Palestinian people. Now, when we ask them, do you want Mahmoud Abbas to implement the roadmap, or do you want him not to implement the roadmap? Overwhelming majority said we want him to implement the roadmap. But when we came to the question of, again, the violence, the role of violence, when we said, do you want him to stop the militarization of the Intifada, or do you want him not to stop the militarization of the Intifada? The voters of Abbas were divided, with only 54%, just a small majority, wanting him to stop the militarization of the Intifada. So I would say, therefore, that despite the willingness of the voters of Abbas, for Abbas, to go on and renew contacts with Israel, reach a peace agreement, improve their economic conditions, enforce law and order in Palestinian areas, the level of support for ending the violence of the Intifada, stopping the armed Intifada, the level of support that Abbas is receiving does not reflect a consensus. It does not reflect a strong majority view among the Palestinian public. It reflects the level of reluctance on the part of the public to give Abbas a free hand to deal with violence in the absence of progress in the peace process. Therefore, that leads me to a second conclusion. It will not be enough also, therefore, to just put an end to the pain and suffering. Abbas must demonstrate to the Palestinian public that diplomacy pays, that diplomacy and negotiations will be able to produce what Palestinians want, which is ending the occupation. That, therefore, the chain for Abbas to gain a free hand, to be able to effectively deal with the violence, therefore, requires steps at the peace process level, as well as the process of the daily lives of the Palestinians, the removal of the closure regime, etc. I know to many of you this looks more like the egg or the chicken. Israel cannot remove the closure regime without the violence stop, and the violence will not stop until Israel removes the closure regime. It certainly is a valid question, and I think raising it is certainly a legitimate issue. But I'm telling you that as we look at other changes that are happening on the Palestinian side, unless Israel shows willingness to take risks at a critical time, as the time we're in, the opportunity that we have been talking about in the previous session is certainly we are certainly going to be missing it. Let me go over the change that I've described, and let me start with in the second chart with the optimism. These are four essential questions that we've been asking in December, right after the death of Yasser Arafat. We asked people whether they thought the death of Arafat will actually increase the chances for peace? I must say, some of those of us who designed the question are sitting here in this room with us, some of the Palestinian researchers. We were very reluctant to ask this question because we believed in the Palestinian society, given the traditional nature of the Palestinian society, you do not speak ill of the dead. And no one was, we believed, was going to say that Arafat's death is going to make it possible for Palestinians and Israelis, more possible to reach a peace agreement. But as you can see, we were disappointed. 53% actually said it does. And I think the fact that people were able to overcome the inclination, given the traditional nature of the society, to say something like this is an indication of a growing optimism in the public mind. The second one was about Sharon. Sharon being a partner. Let me tell you that when Sharon was first elected, back in 2001, we've been asking the Palestinian public throughout the years about every Israeli prime minister, about the level of confidence that this prime minister, that the intentions of this or that prime minister are peaceful, that he indeed wants to move forward with the peace process. Rabin used to receive the highest level of positive rating for his commitment to the peace process. And it was a little over 30%. When Paris came, it remained above 30 or so, a little bit below Rabin, but it was still very clear that people viewed him positively. When Netanyahu came, there was a drop of about 10 percentage points to the 20s. When Barak came, there was a surge. Very quickly, in the early period, there was a surge in the confidence in Barak, but 3 months later, the level of confidence in Barak took a nosedive, and it went down to the 18, 20 percentage points. And when Sharon was elected, it stood at 9%. So only 9% of the Palestinians believed that Sharon would be a partner back in 2001. And as you can see here, we have a majority. More than 50% of the Palestinians now, it's a slim majority, but a majority nonetheless, that believes that there is a partner on the other side for reaching an agreement. I think this is, I would not have imagined we would be getting a result like this with a government, a Sharon government. This is not even a Labour Sharon, this is not a Labour Likud. This is a Likud government when we did this. There was no Labour in the government at that time. And the second question is about this government of Sharon being strong enough to be able to convince the Israeli public to accept a compromise settlement. And as you see, even a larger majority, 58%, saying yes, they think Sharon can convince the Israeli public. The surprising part was about the Palestinian leaders. The perception, prevailing perception, well, this is my perception, is that Abbas is weak. Abu Ala is weak. Yet, as you can see, 56% of the Palestinian public believe Abu Mazen, Abu Ala are strong enough to convince the Palestinian public. I think this is sheer optimism. I find it very difficult to believe that the public actually believes in this if it wasn't in a euphoria of some sort. And I think that's the euphoria that prevailed at a certain, I'm not sure for how long it will remain, but it certainly reflects a new thinking. If you go to the next one, what you see is expectations. This is not what people wish, but rather what they expect to see tomorrow. And I'm showing you here the expectations between September and December. So we're talking about 3 months. The only change in these 3 months, of course, has been the passing of Yasser Arafat. And you can see the first 2 columns talk about negotiations and no violence. That the first 2 columns there, with the 17% and 30%, show Palestinians changing their attitude about what will happen tomorrow, that the parties will go back to the negotiating table and there will be no violence. it's almost, the numbers have almost doubled in terms of people changing their views about what tomorrow will bring. The next column also, which says parties actually will go to negotiations. There will be some violence still there, but as you can see, there is no doubt that if we look at the last two columns, that those who, not the last two, sorry, the one before the last, who said that there will be no negotiations and that there will be no stop in the violence, that this is where a lot of change took place, from 37% to 12%. This, I believe, expresses a very strong optimism about what will happen tomorrow in terms of expectations. Going on again to the next chart with the same question about expectations, a similar question about expectations. This is how, there's a question that we've been asking over the last 4 or 5 years about the level of support for reconciliation between the Israeli people and the Palestinian people within a context of a two-state solution. We ask Palestinians, if Israel withdraws from the West Bank and Gaza, there is a Palestinian state recognized by Israel, there is peace agreement, would you reconcile, would you accept, or would you support reconciliation between the Israeli people and the Palestinian people? Anywhere between 2/3 to 3/4 of the Palestinian public has consistently told us during the last 4 or 5 years that they would support reconciliation under these conditions. Now, then, of course, we ask them, so what do you expect? Do you think it's going to happen? Well, we've been asking this also for the last several years, but actually September is a good, September 04 is a good time, reflecting in terms of reflecting the prevailing attitudes during the last 4 or 5 years. And as you can see, those who said it is not possible ever were 47, with a drop in 3 months to 34. That was a dramatic drop that we have not seen anything like it in the last 4 or 5 years. There is no doubt that the increase from 29 to 39 reflected, that's a 1/3 increase in the public. 1/3 of those who believe that it is possible have the numbers that have jumped by 1/3. And I think this too reflects another level of optimism in terms of public expectation about what will happen next. If you go to the next chart, it shows you yet another indication of optimism. Again, once again, it's about expectations. We've been asking the questions about the roadmap since it has been presented to Palestinians and Israelis, and we ask people about support, but this is not about the level of support. This is about expectations in terms of implementation. Is it implementable? Is there a chance that it would be implemented? And as you can see, those who said it can be implemented increased dramatically from 28% to 46% between June and December. That's again, although the question was asked in June, I think if we asked it in September or even in October, the answer would have remained the same. So I think that too reflects this environment of optimism that prevailed. Now, there could be a lot of reasons why there was optimism. Part of it could have to do with Palestinian expectations about how Israel behaves in the aftermath of Arafat's death. That could be part of it, and which could mean, if that is the main reason behind it, this could simply go away very quickly once the Israelis disappoint the Palestinians and the Israeli government disappoint the Palestinian public. This could be one reason, but there could be other reasons as well. Part of it could be the reduced level of violence that we have seen during this period. Although the Palestinians continue to see many Palestinians being killed during the period, much less Israelis, nonetheless, relatively speaking, this was a period of relative quiet. Let's look at the next chart. That's the second basic change in attitude, and that is the change in the balance of power. The chart shows you the level of support for two groups. For Fatah, and for all the Islamists put together. The Islamists put together represent essentially three groups in this chart. You have Hamas, which is the largest, which account to approximately 75% to 80% of the support for the Islamists. And we have Islamic Jihad and independent Islamists who account for the rest. We put the Islamists all together because we find them throughout the surveys to have more or less similar views on all the basic issues. As you can see, the change in the strength of the Islamists versus Fatah has dramatically changed only between September and December. There has been a slight change. What you're looking at now is the West Bank and Gaza. There will be another chart that shows Gaza only. Also, just to highlight the differences that occurred. The chart shows that the support for the Islamists has dropped from 31% to 24%. The Islamists have seen a slight change in the 3 months prior to that. And that change, we believed, was tentative. Until then, we didn't make a big fuss about the change in the level of support because it was still within the margin of error. And we didn't know whether, in fact, it reflected a real trend in the public or whether it was just a fluke. Certainly, this will remain a big question because we still don't know the answer, since in December there was additional significant changes that could have explained the change in the level of support for the Islamists. Regardless of the reason why the Islamists have suffered a loss in December, part of it, of course, could be the election question that I've alluded to. Hamas decided to boycott the Palestinian elections, which allowed Fatah and other groups to take on the lead and to begin to mobilize public support for themselves. People therefore expected that Fatah was going to, or Fatah candidates are going to win in these elections, and therefore wanted to be to join the bandwagon, to join the group, the winning group, and so they began to shift support. These people who saw an opportunity to make certain gains, and therefore they shifted their support to the Islamists. If you go to the next chart, you can see that this, in fact, was the change in attitude with regard to support for the Islamists is more pronounced in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, up until then, the Islamists, particularly during the last year, the Islamists have done very well in Gaza. And the Israeli disengagement plan, when it was first announced, almost immediately increased the level of support for the Islamists, which reflected what we had already concluded directly by asking the public, do you think the disengagement is victory for armed struggle? Since most people associated armed struggle with the Islamists, the victory, the disengagement was therefore not only a victory for the armed struggle, but also a victory for the Islamists. And therefore the Islamists began to do very well. Remember, this was also a time when Israel was assassinating the top leaders of the Islamists. Yet, it did not do anything to reduce the level of appeal and support for the Islamists, at least not in the Gaza Strip, where the support for the Islamists remained solid until, and in fact, between March and June, and this is the period in which there were assassinations of the top leaders of Hamas, support for Hamas continued to rise. Support for Hamas only dropped after the death of Yasser Arafat. And it dropped significantly in the Gaza Strip, as you can see, from 38% to 26%. Let me go very quickly. I only have a few more minutes, just a couple of minutes to go over the rest of this. This chart shows very quickly where we were in December 2004 in terms of support for immediate return to negotiations. This is the first column with 80%, another 80% supporting a ceasefire, 81%, and this, by the way, 81% is the highest percentage we have seen throughout the last 5 years. 81% support reconciliation within the context that I've described earlier, the context of a Palestinian state recognized by the State of Israel and a peace agreement. The level of support for the roadmap is 59%. Again, I think indicates an increased level of support for the peace process in general. The next chart I want to go over quickly. This is the chart that has been talked about, or one of the charts that have been in the papers today. These are the basic elements of the permanent status agreement. And these elements, I'm not describing them here, but these are the actual issues being negotiated. The actual compromises in these elements are along the lines of the Taba negotiations, the Clinton parameters, the Geneva initiative. So we're essentially talking about similar things, from Clinton's parameters down to the Geneva of last year, of 2003. And in fact, what we are comparing here is the answers to the question about the Geneva compromises back in December '03, and the answers in a couple of weeks ago on the question on similar or identical compromises presented to the Palestinians. And as you can see, there is a significant increase in the level of support among Palestinians with regard to all these issues. The only issues that have not moved in terms of support, as you can look at, these are basically 6 issues, and the 7th one is about identity. I'll explain it. I'm not going to explain what it is about, but the overall trend is very clear that there is a significant increase in the level of support for compromises along the lines of the Taba negotiations and the Geneva Initiative and the Clinton parameters, that is so significant that I believe that the general overall environment of optimism that I've described earlier is responsible for it. Now I want to go over very quickly over the other charts. Since I've already spoken about violence and the armed struggle and the perception of the armed struggle among Palestinians, I'm not going to repeat myself. Essentially, there is very little change there. The public still is convinced that Israel understands the language of force. Palestinians believe that Israel ends its occupation not through talks and dialogue and diplomacy, but by inflicting pain and suffering on Israel. This is a very strong belief among the Palestinian public. Part of it is a reflection of the public own anger, the pain and suffering people feel. People being exposed to so much violence, Israeli violence, in fact respond by wanting more violence, this time against the Israelis. And we can see this throughout the period of the Intifada. It has not changed. There was some fluctuations at one time or another, but the only period in which there was no support or not much support for violence was only during the golden era of the peace process, when Oslo was first being implemented. Hopes were very high that indeed through diplomacy occupation can be ended, but then those expectations very, very, very quickly destroyed, and people again began to believe in violence. This was a gradual process, but as you can see, there was a critical time, and this was the time of Netanyahu, in which the level of support for violence began to increase. If you go to the next chart, this is about the winning or losing. As you can see, although not a majority of Palestinians, but 40% of the Palestinians believed in June. There is a slight drop to 35% in December. That Palestinians came out winning the armed conflict so far. But as you can see, there is no perception that so far it has all been victorious for Palestinians. Only if you go to the next one, this is about how Palestinians perceive other Palestinians, or the majority Palestinians. So as you can see, actually, more Palestinians believe other Palestinians think the last 4 years have been victory for Palestinian for armed struggle than there is. You can see 48%. The previous chart only showed 40%. So there is about 10 percentage points gap between the two. The chart, the last chart, is about the perception with regard to the disengagement. As you can see, through the March, when the idea was first presented, up until December, there has only been a rise in the level of belief that Sharon's plan is victory for armed resistance. And as you can see, the next other three charts is about Palestinian, the respondents' perceptions about how the majority of the Palestinians think. And as you can see, there is no gap. Essentially, what people tell us is what is also the normative prevailing public attitude. And this is what most Palestinians, and that in fact strengthens the significance of this chart, because it clearly shows that this is deeply rooted in the minds of the Palestinians. Thank you.